All right. Good afternoon, everyone. Good evening if you are where I'm at. I'm in Beirut. If those of you are watching from the region, good evening. And welcome to Gaza On My Mind. This is our third episode under the title Nakba and After. It will take us a couple of years to finish this episode properly, but we will try to squeeze it into a couple of hours or a couple of half hours. So we'll be here for about an hour. I am joined by two powerhouses, literally, each in their own right. Jenan Matari, my co-host, and the indefatigable Mouin Rabbani, who has not slept last night in order to finish his work and be on a couple of other engagements right before he joined us. So he is very high on coffee. I suggested other things and he declined. This is Gaza on My Mind again, Gaza ala Bali, episode 2. A quick word about why we're doing this series of conversations. After almost 8 months of slaughter, of Israel's slaughter and genocide in Gaza, there's this expectation that we will somehow go away, those of us who are advocating for Palestine's freedom, and that Gaza coverage will be relegated to optional news, which frankly it started being such. This program here that we're doing is essentially saying we are not going anywhere. The conversation about Gaza must continue. We will keep Gaza right front and center on the daily and weekly. Every week, we'll be hosting a free-form engagement with all things Gaza. As we commemorate the 76th anniversary of al-Nakba, we insist on keeping both Gaza and Palestine centered, not just in the news cycle, in quotation marks, but among us, those who are in solidarity with Palestine and advocating for Palestinian freedom. In this third installment, we are joined by Rana Barakat, as well as Shirin Zarqa Lederman. And in light of recent developments in the States and in the diplomatic field, we have quite a bit to go over. Not least, of course, what is actually happening in Gaza. Let me first start by saying hi to my co-hosts who are with us right now, Mouin and Jenan. How are you? Kifkon?
Hi Bassam, hi Jenan.
Hi.
Hi, Jenan. Jenan is
How's
very
everyone?
very polite today. We are
Well, I'll have to
here.
back out the rage that
I
you
know. I
have
am. I
sent
have so much
me.
rage right now. I think we should do an episode on rage, on how to contain ourselves. Strategies to
Yes.
contain yourself and prevent oneself from being cancelled. So, Jinan and Mu'in, I can't think of two better people to actually have this conversation with, because we all, the three of us, represent different sort of takes on things, even if we meet at the most essential one. So, I'd like to us to just have a free flowing conversation. So please jump in, Jinan. We usually start with you. You kind of ground us as we move forward. So the floor is yours.
Mhm. So every episode, we start off by reminding everyone that the purpose of this is to center Gaza. So when people, last week was the 76th anniversary of the Nakba. People don't always know what the Nakba is, but even worse or more important to understand is that the Nakba didn't only happen, but it has been happening for the last 76 years. So what we're watching happening in Gaza right now is a continuation of the Nakba that started in 1948. So we're going to talk about ethnic cleansing and all of the ways that Israel has been ethnically cleansing Palestinians from our ancestral land, and how it has gotten us to the way that we speak about the Nakba, the way that we teach about the Nakba, is how we've gotten to where we are today, where people have still trouble recognizing that the Nakba ever happened and understanding that the Nakba has been ongoing and it never actually ended. So one of the guests that we'll be bringing on later is actually my aunt, my Chato. She's a PhD in generational trauma and genocide studies. She made a trip out to Rwanda to study the effects of genocide in that area and learn how to apply those studies and healing techniques when it comes to the Palestinian community. And one of the important things that she's fixated on teaching people is that, again, the Nakba never ended. The Israelis have been ethnically cleansing Palestinians, especially when we talk about things like starvation tactics that are being used right now in Gaza. People don't know, or they're not aware, that Israel has actually been starving Palestinians in Gaza for a very long time. They have controlled their calorie intake, and it's why we're seeing a rapid increase in numbers of children who are dying of starvation over the last couple of months. It's because their bodies have been emaciated and they have been a part of ethnic cleansing for years. So I think the most important takeaway from this episode is that as we speak about the Nakba, we don't discuss it in a historical context. We discuss it and talk about it, and continue in our lives to have these daily conversations with people in our lives outside of the internet. Is to always remind them that the Nakba did not end and it's still ongoing. And what's happening in Gaza is a continuation of all of that.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Jenan. Mouin, we'd love to hear from you before we bring in other guests. And I also have a couple of things to say, but you're it.
Thank you, Bassam and Jenan, for your pointed comments. I would just like to take a minute to focus on the historical context, just to make a few observations. The first is I think it's absolutely essential to understand that the Nakba was not somehow something that emerged in the heat of the moment, or an event in which Israel took advantage of circumstances that arose during the late 1940s, but rather it was the inevitable outcome of the Zionist project, because the strategic goal of the Zionist project, was to establish a Jewish state in Palestine. Um, Zionism's understanding of a Jewish state is one in which the Jewish community achieves an incontestable demographic, territorial, and political supremacy. And under the circumstances, that could only happen by transforming Palestine from a country with an overwhelming Arab majority into one with a manageable Arab minority. And that's precisely what happened in 1948. And I think the historical evidence that this was a pre planned and inevitable outcome is incontestable. The second point I would want to make is that people often think of the Nakba as being an exercise in ethnic cleansing, where the vast majority of Palestinians, some 75% at least, who were living in the territory that became the Israeli state, were forcibly displaced, expelled, whatever. Yes, that's part of it, but just as important is what happened immediately thereafter. In other words, ethnic cleansing consists not only of removing people, but secondly, and as importantly, preventing their return. And this was achieved by Israel through a combination of military, legislative, and physical means. The physical means being the systematic destruction of the overwhelming majority of Palestinian villages in the territory that became Israel. The third point is that it's useful to recall that the Gaza Strip as a territory was in fact formed by the Nakba, because the Gaza Strip is that 1.2 or 1.3% of mandatory Palestine in its extreme southwest. on the Egyptian border abutting the Mediterranean Sea that was not seized by Israel in 1948. And it was marked by a tripling of its population from 80,000 to more than 240,000 in the space of a year, with refugees who were forced out primarily of southern Palestine, areas south of Jaffa and Beersheba and areas west of it. So one can't discuss the very existence of the Gaza Strip without relating it directly to the Nakba. And in terms of the situation that we're seeing today, in terms of the catastrophic humanitarian crisis, well, this is not new to people in the Gaza Strip who experienced the first phase of the Nakba in the late 1940s, because the situation then was just as dire, an absolute emergency, an absence of food, shelter, and other basic amenities for a population that again had tripled virtually overnight. And last point I would make is that this is hardly the first time that the Gaza Strip has been attacked by Israel. We, of course, had the 7-month occupation in 1956, 1957, replete with a series of massacres already then, most notably in Khan Yunis, but also elsewhere. Then, after the 67 occupation, we had the pacification campaign in the Gaza Strip, led by Ariel Sharon, which also included the forcible displacement of many Palestinians at the time, primarily to the Israeli occupied Egyptian Sinai Peninsula. And the Gaza Strip, since its occupation in 1967, has functioned as a kind of human guinea pig, as a kind of living laboratory for Israeli counterinsurgency strategies, and for the development of Israeli weaponry and so on. And most recently, as Jenan pointed out, for putting people under siege to the point where Israel had a specialized unit calculating the number of calories that Palestinians in Gaza would require to be malnourished but not die of starvation. So I do think it's absolutely essential to be both aware of the history and to look at the continuities between then and now, which helps us understand this entire issue not as an event but as a process, and one that remains ongoing.
And as a project, right?
And as a project, indeed,
Uh,
because I can just make one more point. Um, uh, Viewers may remember that very early on in October, many Israeli leaders began talking about an objective of the mass expulsion of Palestinians in the Gaza Strip to the Sinai Peninsula. This was actually nothing new. Initiatives to what they call thin out the population of the Gaza Strip, particularly to reduce its refugee population, are even older than the Israeli occupation of the Gaza Strip itself, and first emerged during the 1950s, with over the years a whole variety of initiatives seeking to remove Palestinians in the Gaza Strip to Libya, to Iraq, even to as far afield as Paraguay, and so on. So, yes, very much a project.
Thank you, Moeen. It's it's empowering to hear you assume that there are viewers watching. Um, all right, let's go to our guests.
To you?
Yeah. No, I'm actually joking. We do have a lot of people who are very interested and are live with us right now. I'd like to welcome our two remarkable guests, Rana Barakat and Shirin Zarqa Lederman, who just joined us. We usually take the first 15-20 minutes to just introduce our topic, and hopefully we will do this as conversationally as possible. let me say a couple of words first of all about everybody. It's gonna be easy because Jenan Matari still hasn't given me her bio. She's a two-time award-winning Palestinian storyteller and producer, and she refuses to send me her bio because she doesn't like to talk about herself. But she's a powerhouse that has been a uh, an image trend and analysis setter on social media in ways that a lot of people try to do, but she's been extremely successful. That's how we got acquainted, and we are very, I mean, she is very happy to be here because she's the co-host, she's the co-organizer as well. So that's Jenan. Mouin Rabbani has published and commented widely on Palestinian affairs. You probably are a bit sick of seeing him because he is everywhere. I found him in my closet this morning in Beirut when I entered the hotel. He's literally everywhere. He was just doing a couple of events right before this. He also addresses the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, which is very odd, and the contemporary Middle East. He was previously senior analyst, Middle East and special advisor on Israel-Palestine. There's a typo in your bio, with the International Crisis Group, and head of political affairs with the Office of the United Nations Special Envoy for Syria. He is co-editor of Jadaliyya publication. We are also joined by the amazing Rana Barakat. I'm going to go through these fast. Feel free to say more because we need to get to the conversation. Rana Barakat is associate professor in the Department of History at Birzeit University and the director of the BZU Museum, Birzeit University Museum. She is also one of the powerhouses that co-organized the Gaza and Context series, of which this is a part. We are a co-sponsor of Gaza On My Mind, and she can say more if you don't mind, Rana, saying more about how amazing you are. And finally, Dr. Shirin Zarqa Lederman, who is a Ph.D. in trauma and genocide studies. And Shirin, that's all the bio that Jenan gave me. Jenan is very stingy with bios, so please feel free to talk yourself
That's
up.
really all you need.
Ahlan wa sahlan, Rana and Shirin. Hi.
Hello.
Salamat.
We are very happy to have you join us. Let's hear from Rana, and then Shirin, and then I'll say a few words, which will be a bit boring because they address how we teach not just the Nakba, but we teach Palestine and what has been missing and what has been absent, literally almost absent from the discourse on Palestine, including what the Nakba represents. Rana, you are calling from the West Bank.
Yes.
So ahlan wa sahlan, you have a special privilege, so the floor is yours.
Ahlan bik. Can you hear me?
No.
All good?
Yeah, I can. Everything is
okay.
good.
Ariyah. I just wanted to, I'll speak really quickly. And I'll just add to what people have already been saying. I want to begin by saying that since I've been in Palestine and since I've been teaching at Birzeit, I've come to hate the month of May. Because locally as well as internationally, it's the one time of the year that people commemorate the Nakba. And I find that to be ironic because the Nakba is ongoing. So I actually have a kind of disdain for a commemoration of the Nakba because of the fact that it's ongoing. Though I do understand, I'll sort of circle around back to why I understand why there's a need for a commemoration of it. I just want to add to what Maureen was saying about understanding the basic analytic that's at play in terms of material violence is that it's settler colonialism. Zionism is settler colonialism, and that's important to constantly remind people of, and it's eliminatory. So this genocidal violence and this genocide, albeit is intense and really difficult and omnipresent for the last 230 days, it is not new. Although it is the intensification of it seems new. I would simply add to the timeline that Maureen offered us, I would go back a little further than the 1940s and go back to the marriage of imperialism and Zionism. That goes back to the World War I era and the 1917 and thereon. It's when British colonialism and imperialism married itself to a settler colonial project. And since that moment, in our geographies, we see this eliminatory project and process at play. That's the one thing. That's the first thing I'd like to mention. The second thing I'd like to mention is it's a really hard thing to talk about. It's almost as if I don't have language for it. I was talking to a friend of mine who's also a professor on campus at Birzeit University. His name's Jihad Shweikh. You should look him up because he's a brilliant mind. Jihad is a colleague and a friend, but he's also from a Shatit camp in Gaza, and his kin and his family goes back to Asdod. And in talking to him the other day about all the different kinds of work that we're trying to do and projects that we're trying to do now, he kept coming back to the line that Gaza is alone. And I kept trying to counter that and say that we're doing what we can in the best ways that we can in this forum and all the other forums that we have. But what he said is painfully true. Gaza is in so many ways alone. And the Nakba is not only ongoing, but it's indescribable in its violence right now in Gaza. His family has been dispossessed and displaced more times than he can count, and he is one of many. And this kind of online and streamed genocide is something that's new. And I have to say that several months into this, since October, I still haven't found a language for it. And as often as Bassam, you and I have talked over the last several months, I still come back to that line of this is indescribable. And him, Jihad, telling me that Gaza is alone, in spite of everything that we're doing, is painfully true. So I think that's something that, while Gaza ala Bali and Gaza is on my mind, it's important for us to recognize and realize just how incredibly painful the eliminatory violence that's happening in the Gaza Strip right now is.
Thank you, Rana. I am sure we're going to revisit a lot of these themes that we all discussed in just a minute, but we'd love to hear from Shirin. Welcome, Shirin, to Gaza On My Mind. We are very happy to have you, and the floor is yours.
I mean, Ron, I'm just going to start with what you just kind of spin off what you said. And I think everybody's struggling with that they don't have the words for what's happening. We don't have the words to explain how we feel about what's happening either. Just whether you're, from watching it from afar, I think is a whole nother level of pain. I think that because it's live streamed, we haven't seen before. So in terms of my field, in terms of looking at the trauma that this is creating and the generationality of this trauma, that's one of the things that we see, right? This diasporic witnessing that we've never seen before. So, and that's kind of where I think that's maybe a new spin on the Nakba, but you're absolutely right? It has been ongoing for, way longer than 8 months, of course. And so I think that my struggle has always been to kind of get people to understand that it has been going on for 76 years. And what we are seeing is it's not, and that's where the generational piece comes in. It's not just one generation, the Nakba generation, that has witnessed this, that has experienced it. It's just ongoing generations that are experiencing it. And to me, it very much is a campaign that started through settler colonialism, and that's where the settler colonial trauma comes from. And it's definitely been a process of at least 76 years. So I think that in kind of getting my clients to understand, typically I work with Palestinian Americans, right? My clients to understand that this has been ongoing, that this is not something that we're experiencing for the first time, right? And that a lot of the pain and the difficulty that we're having trying to find the words and trying to educate and just to kind of continue to go on, right, is because it's compounding. It's not just a one-time incident. So I don't know if that's where you wanted me to go with that, but
Absolutely.
I have a question.
We have a great opportunity to actually expand the conversations to precisely the dimension you're bringing. Jenan has a question, and then I'll say my bit, and then we open it up completely.
Okay. Do you think that this diasporic witnessing has helped, at least in your experience with Palestinian American clients who never really understood their trauma before, do you think that this witnessing of what's happening in Gaza right now has kind of helped the community understand trauma that we have lived with and that our parents and grandparents have lived with, but never really understood or didn't understand how much it affected our life? And like, you know, the episode today is titled Nakba and After. Like, I don't know that Palestinians have ever had a vision of like what happens post liberation or like what healing could look like. And now that we have like this compounding trauma that you just spoke of, like, are we even further away from envisioning whatever that after looks like?
I mean, I don't think so. You know, I always say, you know, being Palestinian is like a blessing and a curse, right? The blessing is that we are, I really believe, the most resilient people on the planet. You know, we have a way of rebuilding, which we've done for 76 years. You know, that's also part of the story. We talk about the genocide, but we don't talk about how we've continued to rebuild for 76 years. We've continued to educate. We've continued to pass it along. You know, that social memory is continued. And I think that's also compounding, right? And that's also what we're seeing today with the encampments and the protests and all of that. So I'm very hopeful for the future of Palestine. And for the future of Gaza. I really believe that that if anybody can rebuild, it's us. And I do believe that that's where we're going. And though we may not have a vision, I think we all have a vision, if that makes sense. And that's also, I think, you know, part of being Palestinian, right? All of those creative elements and all of our creativity coming together. Mm-hmm. So yes, I'm very hopeful.
Yeah, we should ask this of everybody in just a few minutes, if that's okay, Jenan.
Yeah.
Yeah. All right. Well, I'm going to be the boring academic a little bit because I actually was preparing something. I prepared something, and then I was asked by the American Political Science Association to answer a question, which is interesting because usually it's, you know, it's political science in America, which is perhaps the most conservative among the social sciences, but that's sort of my department, and it's also populated by a lot of people who don't see eye to eye with those who are advocating for Palestinian freedom. So the question was, what is a most glaring misconception about Palestine? And, you know, one of the things, watching everything that's been happening the past few months, that you want to say that encapsulates the answer is the Nakba and After, right? And I'm just putting these things together. We didn't put this episode together because of the essay, all right? Because there's a Nakba. So the point is that I responded, and I'd like to read because it actually was part of a talk that I gave, and we put it in print. So I'll just share with you a few of these moments from the piece. So my answer is, in one word, the most glaring misconception about Israel-Palestine is context, in quotation marks. Literally the fountain from which all else flows, including an array of misplaced assumptions, arbitrary historical starting points, which we saw with October 7 being the starting point, not just of the Israel-Palestine issue, but perhaps even the starting point of the entire freaking world. And then, of course, a lot of misnomers and, most significantly, glaring blind spots. And perhaps the first order of misconceptions, in my view, in response to the question, because the question was put in good faith, right? And the first order of misconceptions for me is the question itself, because of the misnomer conflict in Israel-Palestine, which is something that everybody in the United States, if you talk to them, even those well-meaning, even those who are now, you know, appalled by Israel's genocide, they still talk about it as a conflict, and they still talk about things like two-state solutions in a particular way, as though the issue is just about states, not about settler colonialism, not about apartheid, not about ethnic cleansing, and so on. So the misnomer conflict is the first order of misconceptions, in my view. Though its usage depends on intention, right? I mean, I've said conflict before. Every one of you here probably has said conflict at some point, you know, for brevity or what have you. A conflict in regional and international relations, however, usually exists between two parties who are equal in relation to their status, notably of sovereignty. In the case of Israel-Palestine, we have a relationship of subjugation, however. one sovereign party, Israel, and another sovereign party, Palestinians, that is completely dependent on the former, not least by virtue of the effective military occupation under which it survived. Under these conditions, the relationship is not one of contention, which is what we hear everywhere in public spaces, between two equal parties fighting over land, resources, or anything else. It's a relation of subjugation, which is the starting point, which is what should be the starting point, of course, starting with the Nakba and after. It's a relationship of subjugation by brute and vastly disproportionate force of one party by another, daily, consistently, unwaveringly, and almost completely for many, many decades. And then enter contexts. Any time or any immediate encounter with such subjugation involves witnessing, if anyone has looked at Israel-Palestine, a military occupation, which is a word that we kind of have grown to see it as invisible because we say it so much, but it's military occupation is the essential starting point, or one essential starting point of context, if you don't want to go too far back. Walls, checkpoints, restricted movement, home demolitions, random and frequent raids, land and other property confiscation, arbitrary detention and imprisonment, total administrative control of people and goods entering and leaving the territory via land, sea, and air, total control of basic resources, food, water, energy resources. This is precisely what was happening in Gaza when people have been saying that since 2005 the Israelis pulled out and therefore it's not an occupation. All this literal drivel. All of these things are occurring with impunity since for many decades. A lot of people cite 1967, but it's far beyond that. It wasn't exactly a situation where occupation, ethnic cleansing, apartheid, and so on did not exist before then. We can talk about this another time. In turn, we witness the existence of two legal frameworks that govern two sets of people based on their racial, ethnic background, one for Jewish Israelis and another for Palestinians. And we should talk about Palestinians living in Israel, and we have done a lot of work on this to demonstrate that, no, it's not that they are equal just because they can vote. They are second-class citizens, and the record on this is basically very difficult to debunk. Within the context of both military occupation on the one hand and a systematic and unabated process of ethnic cleansing, which I will not discuss because I need to move on to other folks here, on the other, this legal distinction and duality becomes possible and increasingly concrete, and there is a term for it, for this systemic form of discrimination, which is apartheid. I'll end with saying very like my basic retort every time people talk about Palestine. We have to go back to history and to the Nakba and after. Plainly and simply, what we can do or should be doing is to reintroduce the concept or the context of subjugation as a starting point, as opposed to two parties in the liberal imagination, A and B, are fighting each other, and one party in October 7th did XYZ, and then there was a retaliation. This is analytical crap. If anyone is discussing any situation elsewhere in the world and they start there, people would reject it. But because we live in the United States, and of course there's Germany who's like more Christian than the Pope, we actually encounter this basically starting point. So what I would like to address is that this context of subjugation is buttressed by the brutally glaring power differential, which is another point. So it's not just a question of subjugation, but a glaring magnificent power differential between two parties, which is not addressed when people say, oh, Hamas has vowed to do this again and again and again and again and again and again and again to Israel, based on this one video by some 16th level ranked person. There is a huge power differential that prevents any of these things from happening, right? It's not the kind of thing that you could actually say party A will do to party B what it says it wants to do, as if they are of on equal footing in terms of their power. And of course, this is in terms of military, financial, administrative, and relational power at the level also of external patronage. Israel is supported by the most powerful country in human history, and so on. Now, incorporating such vast relational and power differentials into the conversation, which is what I always do, whether it's in talking about this in the media, in my classrooms, incorporating this power differential and the concept of subjugation and this type of analysis transforms our existing discussions and conversations on the matter of Israel-Palestine from a cultural one, which is what we're doing right now. We're talking about culture, not politics, to a political one that are that is subject to the falsifiable frameworks that people want to pretend to be doing in the social sciences, but when it comes to Palestine, they don't. So that's my take. It's just an issue of how to address the fuckery that we are watching and observing and witnessing every day in the United States, and people talk as if this is a matter of debate and as if the Palestine-Israel question is a puzzle. It's not a freaking puzzle. It's only a puzzle because we live in America or in a couple of other countries in the world. It's not a puzzle elsewhere. And the Nakba and After is a great starting point for understanding why. Sorry for being didactic. Jenan, would you please take over because I think I made things too dry and boring.
I mean, there's only so much excitement that you can have in your voice when you talk about ethnic cleansing. So I'll give you that credit. But yeah, I mean, going off of the, like, it's not a puzzle thing. And it is very specific. Of course, like other Western quote unquote countries have this issue, but like it feels like a very specific issue that Americans have with understanding Palestine, which is something that Shirin focuses on in her work and her conversations. Like it's getting people to understand what colonialism is and what it looks like and what colonization looks like, and then everything is very easy to understand. And the like recognition that Palestinians are subjugated to daily violence. And so these attacks that the media loves to use as a starting point for their timelines for the conflict, again, quotes, it's all like it's all made up. Everybody talks about context, but it's devoid of context. You know, when people try to get those around them to understand Palestine, they ask for context, but then when they're given the appropriate context, suddenly it's too confusing and they're not political and they don't understand. But it's very easy if you keep colonialism at the root of your education and your, mentality. It's very easy to understand things. It's just all like laid out there for you. That's something Shirin taught me.
Yeah, I mean, it really is. I think the issue that people have is that in order to accept that it's colonialism, you have to accept that your teaching you were taught colonialism. You know what I mean? That everything that especially here in the United States, right? Everything that we have been taught, right? We were taught that, the natives wanted us here and that we helped them and, and we had Thanksgiving, right? And that was the whole story that we told. And so you have to be able to accept that those are the lies that we're told too, and I think that is the big difficulty that people have. And I that's what I think, it's that cognitive dissonance that people have a really hard time reconciling.
Yeah. Like I remember a conversation that I had with former friends. We are no longer friends. But he's American Jewish and doesn't have any family in, Israeli territory, but had some weird, American attachment to this concept of Israel as a Jewish homeland. And back in 2021, we were having this conversation because, this person just kept dropping these like really weird, like inappropriate remarks any chance that they got. It was when my social media just started taking off in 2021 after Sheikh Jarrah had happened. And people started to, gain some interest in learning about Palestine. And every time I was around this person, they would, drop these little comments like, if we were taking a selfie, they, instead of saying cheese, they'd be like, go Israel, like last minute before, the person clicked their camera to take the photo. And it was just like a couple of months of this like really weird, uncomfortable behavior. And finally we like tried to nip it in the bud. And he had said something to me that like really made me realize that people just are resistant to understanding the truth about Palestine and colonialism. And he was like, I grew up my whole life like admiring this foreign land that I've been told I'm entitled to. And it's really hard for me to watch as Israel becomes the bad actor. As in, like, it wasn't always a bad actor. It just like happened out of nowhere one day that these really great people just decided to start mass murdering everyone and stealing their homes. And so that's like going back to, the beginning of this conversation where I was like, we have to talk about the Nakba in an ongoing present context. But you're right, Maureen, in that like we have to get people to acknowledge the historical aspect of it first, and then we can teach them, moving forward, how to like deconstruct everything that they've been taught about Palestine and the existence of Israel from its very beginning.
And that's I think a very typical way that many people in the West have looked at it. You have kind of the beautiful Israel that was established in 1948 in the wake of the Holocaust. It was a national liberation movement. It was liberal. It was democratic. It was utopia, And then in 1967, you had the occupation, and that's when the rot began to creep in. And so it's interesting. I think you see it less now, particularly in the last 8 months. But many people, particularly older generations, still are wedded to this idea that you can separate Israel, let's say, from its relationship with the Palestinians, that you can somehow separate Israel from the occupation. It's almost, like you had this wonderful democracy, but in the United States, but slavery and all the rest of it. Well, that doesn't mean it's not a utopia, if you will.
It's also getting Americans to understand how this country was born in the colonial history and fascist beginning.
Well, I think they do. In fairness, sorry to interrupt you, but in fairness, I think many people do understand. Many Americans do understand their own country, and they see a reflection of that in Israel, and in many cases, that helps explain their support for Israel. In others, of course, it helps explain their opposition to both the reality that the United States is and that Israel is. But I do think, when they talk about shared values, shouldn't always mock it, because some people understand perfectly what those values are and do share them.
Right. So do you think that people see Israel as an extreme example of the United States?
Not necessarily. I think they see a reflection of what they are in the United States. The United States and South Africa, both, significant sectors of their population, both also view themselves as chosen people, fighting the barbarians in the wild, in the jungle, or whatever you want to call it. And I think many people, or many Americans who support Israel but aren't necessarily personally invested in Israel, see a repetition of what they consider positive about the initial history of the United States in terms of its foundation and expansion and manifest destiny and all the rest of it. They see that in Israel, and they love that about Israel, and it helps explain their support for Israel. I think that's perhaps a little more historical. I mean, if you look at it now, um, these types tend to support it more because they see it as an outpost of Islamophobia, or this whole post 9/11 business and so on. But we're used to mocking people who say that shared values form a basis for the American-Israeli relationship. Well, shared values do form a basis of that relationship. It's just not the values that are claimed.
Maureen, when you talk, you have such an impartial voice that it takes a while to find out whose side you're on.
I'm
Okay.
on your side.
Well, I've been inviting you to things, so I hope so. Rana, you and I discussed in an actual teach-in the topic of ongoing Nakba, ongoing return, or from basically addressing Nakba and return. And given that the anniversary was upon us a week ago, and we're addressing all these topics again, what would you like to highlight from this conversation of Nakba and return?
I would like to highlight that it's online and people can watch it at their free will if they want to. That's the first thing. And second, I'd like to just sort of add something to what Maureen and Shirin were talking about, which is that I agree with Maureen. I think if there's going to be the shared relationship, the special bond between the United States and the state of Israel is that they're both settler colonial entities, right? And they're both eliminatory at their very base as projects. And so the unlearning part that Shireen, you were talking about is that as even as Palestinians in the U.S., you are, because I'm not in the U.S. anymore, but you're settlers. And what does that mean to be, a settler? And I think that's part of what we should understand. And part of the conversations, I do agree with Maureen that there are obviously shared values. There are two entities that share at their core the same engine. But to just add to the subjugation argument that you were rightfully giving us, Bassam, is that there's also an obfuscation here, right? The context that you were calling for is the context that is writ large known by a lot of people. So then the question is, I remember being a graduate student in the US thinking, if only people knew, right? Part of what we needed to do was educate people, and if only people knew. And over time, even that long ago, it was when people know, they don't always tend to act in the ways that the values or ethics that we think people would, in terms of humanism and humanity, share. So then it becomes a kind of different conversation of who are we having conversations with, who are we mobilizing with, and that's what we're seeing happening on U.S. campuses, right? Because there are commonalities and there are interwoven traumas, right, Shireen? Is that there's a conversation that can be had over generational trauma that Palestinians have with other folks, indigenous folks that are still at it. They're still resisting and refusing the power, and that can go across the board. And I think that's what we're seeing happen right now. And that's what I mean by return. I mean, return is obviously, for when I talk and write about it, I'm talking about not the right of return, every Palestinian returning to the land of Palestine. But it's also, the point of ongoing is that it's a political, and it's a political ontology of thinking about going back to who, returning constantly in terms of our ethics and who we are and our relationship with Palestine and with each other as Palestinians and with other peoples who are working to get free in the world. So that's what I would like to highlight about ongoing return. But also what I'd like to talk about is that I do agree with you, Maureen. There's no need to I do mock it. I do mock the kind of shared white supremacy, but I think that's what we need to call it, right? Shared values is a shared white supremacy. And I do think what's happening now, really interestingly, is that in 1982 Edward Said wrote Permission to Narrate, and that was after he wrote in the early 1980s The Question of Palestine. And there, Said was sort of laying down a project that people are still working on, right? Trying to get the American public to understand what Palestine is. And he himself, Bassam, used conflict, right? Permission to Narrate in 1982 was born out of, it's a short article, and it was born out of frustration of a massacre that was happening in a war in Lebanon against Palestinian refugees. And it was like screaming, silently screaming in the context of American politics. It didn't want, they did not dehumanize Palestinians. Palestinians were never human in that context, right? And a lot of what he said that long ago remains valid within the politics and the body politic of America. But part of what has fallen is the kind of liberal lie that was told over and over again about what the Israeli project is. And I think Israelis, both in terms of politics and military, are no longer clinging to that. And maybe that's what's happening. That's the hard time that people in the American context are having with, is that Israelis, both as a politics and as a military, are no longer holding on to sort of a liberal guise of what the state is. They're clearly openly fascist and embracing it. And the brutality of the last 8 months has been uncontestable, and I think the fact that it's been documented as widely as it's been documented is that that's the change. Perhaps that's the moment of change. That's the watershed that we're in the middle of, is that the obfuscation can't happen in the same way that it did 20 years ago in terms of the good guys and the bad guys, as it were. That's all, that's a part of, that's something that is, I think, completely fallen. The liberal mask has fallen. The Zionist liberal mask has fallen. And so what do we do next? And I think that's, I don't know, I don't read American politics nearly as well as you two do, but I think that's the kind of scramble that's happening right now within American politics. So they're not quite sure what to do, because Israelis are no longer representing themselves as liberal. So how does that work within an American politic? Are Americans going to have to, claim or admit to the white supremacist sort of foundation of its settler colonial entity, of themselves, and of why this relationship is so incredibly intertwined?
Can I just make a brief comment? I thought Rana used a very
Go ahead. Sorry.
but I think the other
Mouin, sorry, we got cut off.
Yeah?
You got cut off after you said, "Let me make a comment."
Ah,
As you make the comment,
okay.
I'm just showing the teach-in on from ongoing Nakba to ongoing return that Rana Barakat gave, which is
Yeah.
Gaza and Context teaching series number 25 that you can find on PalestineandContext.org. I'll shut up now. Go ahead.
Okay. No, Rana, you made the interesting observation. The liberal mask has fallen off. And while I think that's true, I think there's also another dimension to that, which you implied, which is that Israeli society has shifted so far to the right that it is no longer capable of putting the liberal mask back on, even for propaganda purposes, without violating its core principles. It can't help itself. It can't even pretend to be something acceptable, because to do so would violate its most fundamental beliefs about itself and about the Palestinians.
Did you want to address this, Rana, or?
I mean, I completely agree. And I think one of the things, I mean, location matters, right? So I think one of the things that I can share with you all is being here under military occupation in the West Bank. And I don't want to make a comparison. The fragmentation of Palestine has been further fragmented by the last 8 months. But that's not to say that the ongoing Nakba is ongoing in all of the geographies of Palestine, including the West Bank. And I think one of the things that's been noticeable is, it's twofold. I suppose there are 2 points here. One of the things that's been noticeable is just how relentless the violence is and will continue to be in all of the forms of the violence, including the relentless violence in the West Bank and the settler army and the armies of settlers. That's intensifying and only getting worse. And it goes back to well before October 7th. But this level of intensification, I would argue, this high level goes back to 2021. So it has been going on for some time here in the West Bank. On one hand, we can't even see any kind of strategy here, right? There isn't a, however brutal the Zionist military strategy has been for the last century, and certainly for the last 76 years. And now it doesn't even look like there's no gain or win other than just brutal violence that's relentless, to the point of it shooting itself in the foot, basically, because they're actually, in the West Bank at least, the military, along with the settlers, are unsettling whatever power that whatever co-opted power that they made in this Palestinian Authority. They're killing their greatest ally, basically. So on one hand, you can see this kind of, the annihilation happening is an attempted annihilation of the people of Palestine. But what's really happening is the settler state sort of dissolving into this mess of relentless and not strategical violence. That's on the one hand. And on the other hand, there is what I was trying to read earlier, is I share Shirin's hope. And I do think, Jenan, that we might not necessarily see them as visions of liberation, but I think Palestinians have been producing a solid vision of liberation. What will it look like? But I think Palestinians have been producing, and we continue to produce, many visions and layers of what getting free looks like. So liberation and liberatory and emancipatory have a very solid Palestinian dictionary. But at the same time, there's also a kind of, I think imperialism is dying right now, and there's also kind of frustration with this. Nobody will stop the Israeli state. Nobody is working, no power, as it were, is working to do anything but be complicit in this genocidal violence. That's a short-term thing, and it's a really bloody short-term thing. I don't mean to make it any less intense than what it is, but in the long term, that means there's a watershed. I would argue there's a watershed of a complete geostrategic upheaval that will be a long-term result of these last few years and certainly these last 8 months.
Jenan, you're the time police. How would you like to ask and sort of wind us down? What sort of question would you like to put? We talked a couple of things that we usually end with. I'll leave it up to you to start, and I may have my own.
Okay. So every episode we try to end with a call to action for the movement towards Palestinian liberation, and it's hopefully on brand every episode. So I think the call to action today should be to leave this episode, this teach-in that I know you pretend aren't teach-ins, but this was actually a really great teach-in, and use it to educate one person in your real life, in your physical life, about what the Nakba is and how it's still relevant today.
I'll send it to Mouin.
Just one person, and you'll be surprised at how difficult it is to. Yeah.
We need. Sorry. We do need to laugh. Maybe we should have a conversation about coping or dealing with the situation without going to jail or getting canceled. Although you could go to jail simply by just calling for freedom for people in this country, apparently. Thanks, Jenan. We usually also call for or ask for people to donate if they'd like to donate. We put UNRWA's URL. We did it the first couple times. We're going to change this. We're going to come up with something a bit more direct, a bit more targeted, and we will come back with this next week. And before we give everybody the last word, we would like to know from people what they'd like to have discussed. We had talked about the question of health, and we have talked about the question of food and starvation. They're overlap, but they're two different things at some level. And we've talked about the question of censorship, which deals more with the situation here as opposed to in Gaza, but it's censorship on the question of Gaza. So if people would like to basically share with us their views, you could send an email, and I'll put it up as others are speaking, to S as in settler colonialism. Oh, SC, settler colonialism. SC, yeah, although it's steering committee. Oh, that's bad. SC at palestineandcontext.org, which is basically the URL that you see on the screen, upside down, because that's how the world is right now. So SC at palestineandcontext.org. Feel free to send us basically your suggestions for what you'd like to hear. This is essentially, please correct me if I'm wrong, Jenan, this is essentially a free flow, free form conversations about Gaza with good people, because we're not going to stop talking about Gaza, and we're trying to also make it as productive as can be, and try to as much as possible try to ruin people's vacations this summer by keeping this question and issue and genocide, on our minds.
Top of mind, yeah.
Any final words, Mouin, Rana, and Shirin? Shirin, we'll start with you. We haven't heard from you in the past few minutes, so we can start with you because you probably will have some good things and good vibes to share with us.
Oh God, I hope so. I mean, honestly, I was thinking about Rana and on this idea of on the road to return, and I really think that as part of our coping mechanisms, I think that's something that we need to incorporate, right? Like things that are cultural in nature. I think we get caught up in the politics a lot, and because our identities are so political, I think it's important to focus on the culture and actually celebrate the idea that our culture has been so resilient for so many years, through all of the oppression and the subjugation. So that's what I hope you take away, right? That I hope that you really, I kind of always push people to push into their communities, and whether that's just experiencing culture or protesting or just being in community. So that's what you can all take away with.
I love that.
Anyone else? Mouin?
Yeah,
Okay,
I have
Rana,
something
even
to say
better.
really quickly. Sorry, Marian. Sorry. Thank you, Shirin, because that's exactly sort of.
No, I'm good.
I don't know if it's a coping thing, but the ongoing return was born out of this feeling of never-ending violence, right? And I was trying to think about how to just do a pivot and not drown in the never-ending of it. And it was actually the scent of jasmine that was sensual that helped me figure that out. And it was a scent that reminds me of my grandmother's house. It reminds me of Jerusalem. And planted jasmine on my balcony in Ramallah because it's en route to return. That's a really nurturing and helpful way of thinking about who we are and where we belong. And that's a way to think that the violence is not defining us. The violence is because of who we are and where we belong. But it's not our definition. That's the first thing that I'd like to say. The second thing is that there's this photo that's now going viral. I guess it was today or yesterday, of an Israeli soldier sitting in the library of Jamaat al-Aqsa of Aqsa University, and he's setting fire to books behind him. That's what Zionism is. That's exactly what Zionism is. And I think there's no reason or need to describe it as anything other than that. And, I don't know if we need the word scholasticide, but one of the things is we're professors on campus, you and I, Bassam, and I think that's one of the things that we need to constantly talk about, is that every university in Gaza has been destroyed. The universities in the West Bank have been constantly attacked. 3 days ago, about a week ago, we had another martyr that was brutally shot down, who was a student at Birzeit University. That's what Zionism is. They're attacking our basic core of who we are. The first targets in October were bakeries and hospitals, and they remain targets. That's what Zionism is. Palestinians are about ongoing return, and I don't mean to say that there's a dichotomy here, but what I do mean to say is it's necessary for us to talk about what Zionism is. It's brute force and violence, and the coping mechanisms, Shirin, are part of who we are. Generationally, it's part of who we are, and it's something that's to celebrate, and it's why we're being attacked.
Thanks, Rana. Just to say that our first episode, right, Jenan, was on scholasticide in Gaza and reverberations in the United States. Second one was on journalism, also in Gaza, and media and representation in the West. And this one is on Nakba and return. So yeah, these are the themes that we have addressed. Mouin, give us your last word, but I want to put something up on screen, and if you can just throw in a minute on this question of Ireland, Spain, and Norway recognizing the Palestinian state and how this has opened the door for others that are likely to join. You don't have to make your comment about this, but if you could just say something about this, because a lot of people are responding to it differently. Some people are happy, some people are happy with caution, some people are like, this is a bit of a distraction since there's nothing concrete. So I'll just leave it up to you. You can ignore it as well.
Yeah, no, I think it is politically significant. And one reason I think it's politically significant is if you look at the hysterical Israeli reaction, it clarifies that this is a state that is used to total the board impunity, and the slightest challenge to its God-given right to deal with the Palestinians unilaterally without any outside interference whatsoever creates these hysterics. They see this as a direct attack on their very existence. That's how far off the reservation these people have gone. Secondly, it's going to remain a purely symbolic move unless it is accompanied by practical, concrete measures. Those states that recognized Palestine yesterday said they did so to preserve and promote a two-state settlement. Well, you can't have that without the end of occupation. And simply recognizing Palestinian statehood does not end the occupation. You need practical, concrete measures like banning Israeli settlement products from the European markets, for example. My last comment would be that I think, in the larger scheme of things, it's too little, too late. The time to have recognized a Palestinian state would have been, for example, in the late 1980s, when the Palestinian state was initially proclaimed by the PLO, or during the 1990s, when it became abundantly clear that Israel had absolutely no intention of ending the occupation and was preoccupied with the expansion of existing settlements and establishment of new ones. But to come 40 years later, when virtually every Palestinian, aside from Mahmoud Abbas, has lost faith in this paradigm, and when Israel, with US support, has done everything possible to undermine it, I believe is going to be seen as too little, too late.
Jenan, can you let us all go free?
Yeah, you act like I'm the one holding you hostage.
Let's not talk about hostages.
What did you say? Oh shit, wrong word.
Release them. Release only the Israeli hostages. Don't worry about the 10,000 Palestinian ones.
That'll be next.
They're
lesson.
not hostages. They're terrorists. Especially the children.
Thank you, everybody. I know this was a heavy discussion, but I think we did good.
Thank you for having
Thank
me.
you for
Thank
all
you.
this endless work. Thank you. Thank you
Thank you.
for the endless energy that you guys have, and you guys share with us. Thank you.
Thanks, guys. We'll see you next week. We'll announce what the conversation will be on, and it's likely to be at 2 p.m. on Thursday, but we'll also announce it. Shukran, Mouin, Rana, Shirin. You guys are beautiful, and you inspire and empower us and everyone. Salam. Jenan, all power to you as usual. Salam.
Yeah, bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye.